She is also interested in histories of language and writing, sociology and texts and journals of writing about the past. Her recent publications include history and autoethnography, accounting for the indigenous population of Yunnan, 1550 to 1650. In the Journal of Colonialism and Colonialism, we welcome you.
Wrote about their hometown and how it varied according to the different genres they were writing in and the different types of audiences they were expressing. Okay, so my research is about the city of Dali. So here it is on the map, the yellow dot. If you look at the map, Dali, I place it in the center, right? But often when we think about the history of China, we're talking about this one, right? So here will be Beijing, here will be Shanghai, here will be Guangzhou, Hong Kong. Okay, but in fact, Dali is also part of the Himalayan world, right? So there have been trade routes going north and south up into Tibet, down into Burma, down in the southeast until what's now Vietnam, and then as well as east into different parts of China. And these trade routes have been going on for maybe 2,000 years that we know of for sure, right? It was part of their Kauri trading system that was going all through the Indian Ocean, and even until the 17th century we have records of Kauri being used for the Indian. Okay. So let's zoom in. If you look at this map, you can see again, here's the Himalaya, here's the kind of movement from the mountains down into Southeast Asia, right? And they all come through Yunnan. Over here, Lake Dian is the capital of Yunnan now, Kunming. And up here, Arhai, is the city of Dali. And the city of Dali was the capital until the Mongols went through in the 13th century. The city of Dali was the capital of independent kingdoms, right? The Nanchao Kingdom, followed by the Dali Kingdom. And it's also the crossroads of the trade routes, right? So it's an area that has had a very long-term trading relationship with everywhere around. And so it's also an area that has had like a very stratified society for a long period of time, right? So there have been kings and like nobility, and there have also been monastic institutions, Buddhist monasteries, so on, for a long period of time. Okay. So on this map you can see the city of Dali. Here. Yep. To the east, there is a lake. It's called Lake Arhai. To the west, you have Mount Tianshan, or Sanshan sometimes. And for people in Dali, these are like the two big things that you know, right? They're the two markers of local identity. They're also both very famous. It's a very famous tourist area nowadays, right? So many people will go there because the scenery is supposed to be very beautiful, and the air is supposed to be very clean, and the environment is supposed to be very comfortable. Okay. Okay. So during the Nanchao Kingdom period, which was from roughly parallel with the Tang Dynasty, so that means it's from about Zhao is a word that's not commonly used in Chinese, but in this area it means a type of kingdom. It's probably related to a Thai word. And the six Jiao, the Nanka was formed out of six Jiao. So there were six kingdoms around the lake of Dali. So there was one in Menghua, one in Jiaozhou, one in Dongchuan, one up there, one here, I think one over here, right? In the kind of valleys, right? So this is an area with mountains and valleys, and people do agriculture in the valleys, right? And then in the mountains there are different groups of people that they differentiate themselves from, who are the kind peoples. Yeah. Okay. So the Nanta was formed when the ruler of the southern one, the Hmong clan, M-E-N-G, Hmong, conquered the other five. He invited, according to the legend, he invited all the rulers to come and do a sacrifice with him. And they went into a tower to do this annual sacrifice. And then he burned the tower and they all died. And so they became king. Okay. So he becomes the king and then he moves the kingdom capital to Haifa, right? So the ancient city is here. And then this little strip of land in between the mountain and the lake becomes the capital of that area for the next, until now, 1500 years. Okay. So when we think about Yunnan in the context of Chinese history, we think, okay, this is a peripheral area, it's far away from the historical centers of Chinese civilization, it's far away from the political centers of Chinese states, it's far away from all the cultural activity, there's probably not much sources, right? And if there are sources, the sources are probably written by agents of the state who went to colonize and to try and rule the people who were living there, and they would write things like ethnographies or records of their military conquests, various kinds of things like this. It's all state documents. And that's what people have generally believed. But Dali is a very unusual place in the context of Southwest China because it was the capital of this Nanta kingdom, right? So it had a stratified elite for a long period of time, who had spent a long time, they were very quickly able to educate their sons in the fairy Chinese, right? Even before the Mongols came through, there were Buddhist monks who were reading and writing Chinese sutras, right? So they would have some connections already, and they had the resources in order to be able to become fluent in the fairy Chinese, to take the civil service examinations, which was what would allow them to enter into government in the Chinese imperial state. And most importantly, they were able to read and write about themselves in genres and in language that would be understood and circulated and preserved, right? Some of the other peoples nearby did read and write in specific contexts, in non-Chinese scripts, but most of those, we don't have anything preserved from this early, right? We have things preserved only from the last 3 centuries. Okay, so how exciting, we have these sources. What do we know about them? What do the sources look like? These are the 3 questions that I want to sort of start us thinking about as we go through on that side. If we're thinking about funerary inscriptions specifically, who are the people who are in those areas? Those inscriptions, right? How did these texts come to be? And for That's the formal establishment of the Ming Dynasty. But it takes another 15 years to get from eastern China all the way to Yunnan and to make Yunnan part of the Ming Dynasty as well. So 1383 is when the Ming army arrives in Dali, specifically. Okay. So when the Ming set up their empire, they re-established the civil service examination system, and they are very gung-ho about things like Confucian lineage rituals for the whole of the population. Right? In the Song Dynasty, it was mostly the elites who practiced lineage rituals, but according to the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty, everybody must now practice appropriate family rituals. That includes, coming of age ceremonies and wedding ceremonies, and of course, death and funeral. And what is the appropriate mourning period for your father, for your mother, for your brother, etc., etc., etc. Okay. So, in the early 15th century, we have the first examination graduates from Dali. So, there's 3 levels of the examination system. Then you take an exam in the local level. If you pass that, you can take the exam at the provincial capital. If you pass that, you can go to the capital, like the capital of the empire, and take the examination. And after you have passed, you can be assigned a job in the civil service. So that could be something in the capital, or you could be assigned as a prefect or a magistrate or something anywhere in the empire. Typically, you're not allowed to be assigned to your hometown. That's really important. And your assignment is for 3 years, and it can be renewed once. So the goal of this is to reduce corruption, right? So people are not getting too invested in the place that they're ruling, and so they won't take bribes too much from the people who are powerful there, right? Okay. So from that period on, we have the first ones in the early 15th century, and then gradually, there's an increase in the number of families from Dali who are educating their sons in the classical literary tradition, which means they're able to take the examination, which means they're able to become officials. If you are an official, you and all your family members are exempt from taxes. That's great. You're also exempt from corporal punishment. That's also really important, right? So it was like benefit to the whole family if you can encourage one member to take the examinations and succeed. Okay. In around the turn of the next century, there were a lot of earthquakes in Yunnan. This is important because a lot of structures and also a lot of inscriptions were destroyed, right? So there's a lot of sources who were destroyed around it. But we also have a lot of rebuilding in the middle of the 16th century. Okay, so in the middle of the 16th century, there are big changes in the Ming Empire as a whole, right? It's a period that's famous for commercialization. So more and more people are engaging in trade. Instead of staying in the villages, they're going to the cities. There is cheap books available for the first time, right? So there's a lot of paperbacks, and there's a lot of new publishing houses growing up that are able to circulate books cheaply. So we have a lot more sources, like of every kind, from the middle of the 16th century, and especially we have a lot of paper sources, right? Okay, that's another thing. And it's also the period where you start to have things like silver coming in from foreign trade, right? Foreign trade had always been going on, of course, but after the European powers start extracting silver from the New World, there's an increase in the amount of silver in the world economy generally, and a lot of it is going to China, right? Because the European powers want to buy tea, and they want to buy silk, and gradually over a period of time, the Chinese economy as a whole shifts to silver. So previously taxes were collected in the form of grain primarily, but after the middle of the 16th century, they start to collect taxes in silver instead, right? So we can think of the changes to the economy in terms of commercialization as something much wider circulation of sources, and a lot more sources have survived, right? And it also meant that more and more people were able to educate their sons to take civil service examinations, but the number of jobs did not increase. So we have this problem that one faces sometimes, where there are a lot of graduates and not enough jobs. So you have a lot of educated people who are trying to make a living somehow, right? Whether it's by teaching or whether it's by making books, publishing, all these kinds of things. And so that's another reason that we have a lot of written sources from this time period, right? There are people who can read and write and don't have as much to do. One thing you can do is perhaps get paid to write a funerary inscription by someone who cannot read and write, but would like a nice inscription for their family, right? So this kind of thing is a source of income as well. Okay, so in 1675, okay, so the next thing we skip 1644, which is when the Qing, the Manchus from the northeast, overthrow the Ming Dynasty. The end of the Ming Dynasty is in 1644, but again it takes them some time to get to Yunnan, and also Wu Sanwei, who was one of the holdouts, one of the Ming generals who was holding out, did not submit to the Qing, sets up his capital in the southwest, right? So in 1675, the Qing defeat his rebellion, and Yunnan becomes officially part of China again, the Qing Empire. And then there's another rebellion in the middle of very towards the end of the 19th century. So Dali, or Yunnan in general, is an area with a large Muslim population, partly because of the Mongol armies that came through, and many of the people in the army were Muslims from Central Asia who had submitted to the Mongols already, and many of them stayed in Yunnan. So there's really a large Muslim population in Yunnan for several hundred years at this point. In 1856, a Qing official massacres a lot of Muslims, and so there's a rebellion following that, right? And Zhu Wenxiu sets up his capital in Dali. Okay. Okay, any questions before we move on? Yes? Yeah.
New Confucianism.
New Confucianism. Yes.
New Confucianism may be open way for other languages. Then earlier on, the Orthodox ideology was that the only way to happen through the civil service examination. New Confucianism, they were focused more on Indian development, moral self-cultivation. On that is the reason why there is more self-cultivation.
Okay, so Neo-Confucianism, I would think of as more of a response. And the other thing that's important is that it's in the Sung Dynasty, right? It's before the Mongol period. And that, what happens then is the literati elite change from being mainly focused on landed gentry, the great families of the Tang Dynasty, who had all been killed in the Adon Shan rebellion, to this kind of new idea. This is the Ball's thesis of like a literati elite, right? So this is the idea of the examination elite comes from that time period. Yes. But of course that does not explain the change that happens. So that's when we start to have printed books circulating moderately. But the change that happens in the 16th century is like several hundred years later, right? So that explains why. So Neo-Confucianism we can think of, or I wouldn't say it's Neo-Confucianism that's causing it. I don't know that I would go with that causative process, but it's creating conditions. It's the ideology of the literate elite, and it's creating the conditions by which people in the 16th century who are having these new social conditions will go in that direction, go in the direction of promoting the cuisine, go in the direction of promoting books, rather than something else. Yes? So what were the kinds of funerary practices that were practiced in Dali? So this will become obvious when we start looking at sources. So one thing is you cannot generalize from Dali to the rest of Yunnan. Yunnan is, as you say, it's a very mountainous province. There are many language groups. Many of the people there have their own local practices that are very different from other people in Yunnan. So, and certainly different from people in China. The big one that we probably need to keep in mind as far as Dali goes is cremation versus burial, right? So the Confucian practice is burial. The Buddhist practice is cremation. That's the kind of basic issue. But we can see that these people in Dali, who identify most people, as many people in China, they identify with more than one religion. And so they might practice one or the other, but still also they will practice both of them in different times of their life for different contexts. Yeah, and you can see in the inscriptions, in the material remains of the funerary practices, that kind of difference. We don't have a lot of detailed records of the earlier practices, unfortunately, from what we can see. There's a few inscriptions that have survived, but very few. Okay, so this is the most modest of the extant funerary inscriptions. It is called Shundao Bei. So Bei means a ceiling, which is a stone thing that's like vertical-ish, usually. Okay, so this Shundao is like the spirit path staircase. So these were commonly used in Tang Dynasty graves. They were not necessarily Buddhist, but the idea was there's a pathway between for the spirit to go, as in the passing, right? It's telling the ghost how to leave the body, basically. Okay, so let's have a look at this ceiling. What can you notice in the ceiling? We've got a seated Buddha right here. Can anyone see these letters in circles? Yeah? Anyone know what the script is? So it's a sit-down script, which is it's a Nagari script, but it had gone out of Lucidity much before this. It is still used in Japanese Buddhism. So, in this case, it seems like there's it's not particularly common in Chinese Buddhism, but it must have moved through, right, Dali. For some reason it stayed here, as well as being picked up in Japan. Okay, and so in the middle, it would have a square. In here, we have the name of the deceased. Which is Zhao Bi, and then Naguan is a Buddhist name that they also adopted, right? And the title is basically this, the true passage of Zhao Naguan Bi. Down there. And you can see that these characters are large, and then the name is small, right? So it makes you think maybe, oh, they wrote the name afterwards, right? They had a standard format, and they just put in the name at the end. Okay, on the left, we have the family of the deceased, and the date. On the right, we have the name of the scribe. And these are all in Chinese characters, right? They're legible to anyone who can read and write Chinese. Okay, we also have some mu bei. So bei again means a ceiling. It tells us it's full. And mu is chun, so it's a chun ceiling. And this one is from 1495. Again, it's vertical, and there's a fan-shaped header at the top. You also get this in non-tomb steles sometimes from this period. If we look at the header, what can we see? Yeah, we've got the two scripts. So again, we have this sit-down script around it, and we have this here in the middle as the title in regular Chinese script. So sometimes you will have seal script in this kind of context, but in this case we don't have that. Okay, and then, yeah, so on this side, we have the Hansa inscription, which is the kind of normal funerary inscription. And on the back, we have something in Nagari, or a sutra, in fact. So it goes into all of the little words, and then you tap the ink. Yep. And so when it dries, you have this, right? And so in Imperial China from the Song Dynasty, when they were, one of the things that the Song Inscriptions were into was, well, they were opposed to, in fact, was antiquarianism, which was this idea, oh, we have to go back to the past, right? We have to go back to the classical civilization. And one of the things that was a lot of collecting. And they also did a lot of rubbings, which means it's a way to make a record of a stone object that is, it's stone, right? It's subject to wear. It could, it will degrade over time, right? Necessarily, right? But you can still find out what it says if you have the rubbings. So sometimes when you're asking like rubbings rather than stone inscriptions, it shows, oh, I went to this place, I saw this amazing ancient inscription, I took a rubbing, and so it increases your visual correct, basically, right? Okay, so collecting rubbings is very popular. The other thing, it's also very useful. In the 1940s, we have a lot of rubbings from this place that I will talk about a bit later. But anyway, so any of these images that have this kind of thing, this black thing, it's a rubbing. Such as this one. Okay, so the fourth type is a Munjane. So this is the most standardized Gujarati funerary inscription from this period. And it's different from all the others because it is an entombed epitaph, which means when you are buried, this thing, it's like a square, is put in the grave with you and then it's showed up. Right? So the other ones, they're all for people to read later. Right? They're trying to, they're expecting that the descendants, when they come to do the sacrifices every year at their ancestors' tomb, will be able to read it and then know something about their ancestors. But these are not like that. So if they are recorded, if the person who wrote them is famous, they might keep a copy of them for themselves and include it in their collected works that someone they know will compile for them after their death. But otherwise, we only know about them from later excavations. Okay, so it's got two sides, right? It's a square. One side has this. This is seal script, right? So this is the title of the funerary inscription. And then the other side, this one is broken, but it's just the narrative passage. This one from 1580, and it's the Yunnan is the most famous literatist from Bali. He wrote a bunch of gazeteers. He single-handedly kickstarted Buddhist temple reconstruction efforts in this period. The famous Krika temple in Bali is something, it had mostly been destroyed in those earthquakes about 50 years before that, and he was like, no, I'm going to fix this up. I'm going to get all my family to donate, I'm going to get all my friends to donate, and I'm going to pay for these 8-ton period, 9-hour period for goods to be restored, etc., etc. And he's buried in the grounds of that monastery. Which is interesting because it's a Buddhist site, but he is buried according to the most Confucian version of the funerary inscriptions, right? So he's got this kind of dual identity. He's an exempt metropolitan degree holder, very Confucian tradition, but also he's very attached to Buddhist institutions in his own area. Okay, so we've seen this map before, more or less. So we have this plane. Dali City is here. Taipa is the Nanjang capital there. Down here is Kunming, so that's where you go. Up here is where you go up to Tibet, basically. Okay. And here is Shizhou, which is a town it's quite a nice tourist area nowadays, but it was also in the early 20th century an important town because a lot of the trading families that controlled the trade to the south into Burma were based there or were from there. Okay, so there's Shizhou. So this is taken from the mountain, looking over the plain, right? And then you can see the lake in the background. Okay. So, the biggest cemetery that has survived is called Cemetery. And it's just a little bit west of Shizhou. ancient town in the mountains. It was in use from the 14th century straight through to the 20th century. And it had mostly been destroyed in the late 20th century. But in the 1940s, when Japan had invaded all of eastern China, all the universities in Beijing, they got their students to walk all the way down to Yunnan, right? So there were a bunch of students, a bunch of PhD students, a bunch of academics sitting in Kunming going, what do we do? Like all our research, we had to leave it, right? I can't go to my field site. What can I do? And so one of the things they did was get interested in Yunnan. And so we have, they went around taking rubbings of all the distilleries they could find in Yunnan, especially around Dali, because there were a lot of them, right? A lot more than maybe they expected. So we have even a number of distilleries that have been destroyed since then. We still have the rubbings because they were made in the 1940s and kept in the Dali Museum. Okay. And now they're being pushed by the local historical society. It's like, okay, we want to share our distilleries with everyone, so they publish rubbings and transcriptions of all of these sources. Okay. So, if we're thinking about Hongkong, two questions. Who was buried there? So most of the funerary inscriptions that we have are of men. Quite a lot of them are of couples, right? So it was a point of honor for a married couple to be buried in the same grave. And sometimes, depending on who died first, there might be both of them described in the daily inscription. There are a few of individual women, but not very many. Most of them are from Dali, right? There's not that many of people who themselves had come from somewhere else. There's a few who are Buddhist monastics. Normally you would think, oh, they won't be buried in this kind of cemetery, they might be cremated or whatever, but some of them, especially if they were from an important family in Dali, their family is like, we're going to have you buried with us. So there's a few of those. Many of them are identified as being from prominent families. It's hard to know how much that they're just talking it up, right? They're like, oh, well, you know, I obviously, you can say wonderful things about my deceased father, so I'm going to say our family's very important. But most of them are not degree holders, right? There are some, but most of them are not. They have mixed attitudes towards doing conquest. There are some who are like, they just take up official positions at the Ming straight away. Some of them are like, oh no, I'm just going to retire from public life. I'm not in favor of this new vision. And there is some overlap between the people who are buried there and the people who wrote the inscriptions. So there's not, it's not like one-to-one, it's not like a very close network, but there is some overlap. Yeah. Okay, who made the series? Almost all men. There's maybe two that are composed by a woman, or partly composed by a woman. There's maybe a few more where a woman is involved in sponsoring it, right? The woman has asked someone the widow has asked someone to help her to live for her husband. There are quite a lot of maybe more Buddhist monastics who are involved in writing or steel scripts or something than are buried there. There's a few officials from other places, right? So people from other places don't typically die in Dali, but if you are wanting a famous person or someone with a lot of prestige to write the inscriptions for your deceased relative, you might ask an official if you think they're a nice person and a big name ideally, but if they're a big name, they're probably not in Yunnan. Anyway, okay, in later inscriptions, many of the authors have degrees, and the first of those first few Dali degree holders, they were very popular writers of these kinds of things. So one of them, called Yunnan, reappears a few times. So in the process of making a student, you have the person who writes the script, you have the person who makes the copy, that perhaps does the calligraphy, you have someone, a third person maybe, to write the sealed script, right? And then you'll have, all three will be literati, and then they will pay somebody, a workman, to carve everything onto the stone. And there's basically, like, some of the carvers do multiple, you see them multiple, they do put their name on it, and they might do it a bunch of times, but they don't overlap with the composers or the calligraphers. Okay, so what are the sections of a stele inscription, right? This is, these are kind of similar for the entombed epitaphs and the steles that are not entombed. So there's a title usually, sometimes in the header, sometimes it's the first thing written, so it's top to bottom, right to left. The first thing will be the title. Then there will be a few lines saying who composed it, the composer, the copyist, and the seal script writer. And it will give all of their titles, every job they ever had, where they're from, their courtesy name if they have one, and their given name. Then there is a preface. So this is a prose section that can be quite long, and it will say various things. Then there is an elegy. So the elegy is the key part of the inscription, actually. It is a poem that is necessary to have, basically, for a funerary inscription, right? When somebody dies, we need to have an elegy, a poem that some of them we think would have been recited in the funeral, but also they have to have a carved in the stone. And then the preface is basically explaining everything that's in the elegy, right? There'll be a reference to the place that they came from, and it'll be a poetic reference. And so you need to have the verse then say, actually, it was this place, right? So everyone knows what it actually is. Then at the end, it lists the sponsors and sometimes the carver, and then it lists the date. Okay. For the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to walk through 5 examples of funerary inscriptions from Delhi, from the earliest, well, a little bit more than 5. Anyway, and we're going to pick out some of the narrative elements that relate the entombed people from Delhi to some kind of larger historical narrative, typically relating to how their family came to Delhi, or its history, or what one of the things the family members, ancestors had done. Okay. So the first one is, the first thing I want to pull out is this idea of the Nanja kingdom as a Dali touchstone, right? So people don't say very often, I'm from Dali, Dali is my hometown, I identify someone from this place. They do say, my ancestors were the Nanja, right? Is it true? No idea. But what we do know is that people in this time period thought that the Nanja were the main historical, prestigious phenomenon to be associated with, right? They don't say, they served the Tang dynasty, or they served they say Hmong sometimes, but if you want to identify yourself as being someone from Delhi and from an important family, the Nanja was the way you do that historically. Okay, so here we have one from 1420. And the title is the tomb inscription of Mr. Young. And the seal script, it's not composed by Yunnan, that's one of those first examination graduates from Delhi, but he did do the seal script for the top. Okay, and so the first line of the preface. The deceased's taboo name is shown, so that means his personal name, his given name. By courtesy, he was a local Hmong man from Taipo. So Hmong Jiao was the family name of the Nanja Kingdom ruling family, right? So instead of saying he's a Dali person or he's a person from the Nanja Kingdom, they're using the name of the royal family from the Nanja Kingdom, the Hmong, as their identification point. His grandfather was a very Ajali. We don't know what exactly this is. We think it's a transcription of some Sanskrit word, but there's quite a lot of debate among scholars about what exactly it's meant to be transliterating into Chinese. What we do know is this is a title of a Buddhist religious professional that was used in Dali Buddhist, specifically only in Dali Buddhist temples and monasteries in this period. So, some kind of Buddhist, his grandfather was a great Buddhist leader. His Tibetan name was Zhu. He was proficient in esoteric teachings and was a monastic official during the Hmong times. Okay, sources, so they weren't writing things down themselves, but they were interacting with both Tibet, the Tibetan Empire, the Tang Empire, and there are some written sources from there. And they mostly talk about, in terms of the civilian official government, that is the bureaucracy that was familiar to the time, right? So they had a bureaucracy, they're like, okay, this seems to be the Nanjao equivalent. In fact, it seems like they also had some kind of monastic involvement in state administration. So that's what this is telling us. So the grandfather's name was Dian and his father's name was Bao. So the narrative here is, here's the founding person in our family, here's the nice Gao, and then here's grandfather's father, me. Yep. So, okay, so this is a pretty common pattern when you look at funerary inscriptions like this, right? You have to have, you know the deceased, you know their father, you know their grandfather, maybe you know some people before that, but the family ancestor of the lineage is the person who's the most important. Okay. In this, the rest of this inscription, there's not that much discussion of the family history. There's a little bit of discussion of the deceased, and then there's even a much longer section about the process of commissioning the ceiling. But the one thing about that that's important is it was this man, Mr. Yang Sheng, his wife was Yang Wu. So that's her maiden name, not her. You don't change your name. Women don't change their names when they get married. They did not have any sons. They had a daughter. The stele was commissioned by their grandson. And so it's a little bit unusual for a woman, the kind of orthodox Confucian process is it's only the male line descendants that are important. In practice, we know that's not always the case, right? And in this case, Yang Sen spends a great deal of time explaining how wonderfully filial the grandson was to be following his grandfather's, carrying out his grandfather's wishes and ensuring that there's a suitable funerary inscription for him. So what this is telling us is, regardless of their Buddhist credentials and their Nanjao credentials, filiality was a really important value that they were willing to emphasize in their funerary inscriptions, right? They will praise somebody for being very filial with his son. Okay. Yeah, I didn't include them, but there are some other inscriptions that also mention they have the earliest ancestor, instead of coming from China, is specifically mentioned as having come from India with the Shoga. And then it's the same thing. This earliest ancestor here, so the Nanjao, nothing for several reasons. Okay, second example. Here we have three inscriptions about the Wu clan. So the first one we have is a very brief inscription in the tomb of a woman named Wu Han. So this inscription is not from the Hongwei cemetery. It was excavated from the city wall in Dali. So, you know, when you run out of stone to build your city walls, you might use whatever you've got available. Maybe that's tombstones, so be it, right? So a bunch of stones were repurposed as part of the city wall in Dali at some point, we don't know when, but they were excavated from the city wall in a rebuilding that took place in the 1980s. So her funerary inscription is one of those. And it's very brief, and it's also not in great condition, so we don't know very much about her. We know that she was married to a man called Wu, which is, it seems like it's a Chinese transcription of a Mongol name, right? And her name as well as a Chinese transcription of a Mongol name. And they are said to have arrived in Dali as part of the Mongol armies in the late 13th century, middle of the 13th century. Yeah. Okay. stupa in the monastery grounds, right? It was set up in 1378, so this is at the very end of the Mongol period, but before the Ming have arrived in Dali, so they give the date in the Mongol reckoning. And in that one, it really talks about Reinan's career as a Buddhist monk in this monastery and how he promoted, the health of the monastery. It also emphasizes his connection to the Duan clan. The Duan clan were the rulers of the Dali kingdom, in which after the Nanzhao and before the Mongols came through. And when the Mongols conquered them, at that time, they were basically subordinate to their prime ministers. Their prime ministers, the Gao clan, the hereditary prime ministers, were effectively ruling, and the Duan clan was subordinate to them, even though they were the official kings, right? What they did when the Mongols came was the Duan clan made a deal with the Mongols, and so they were given Yunnan as their appanage, which is in the Mongol system of granting favors, basically, patronage. And so his stupa really emphasizes his connection to the Duan clan. And in fact, the Duan clan did survive the Ming conquest, which was about to happen, right? So the Duan continue as the local rulers on behalf of the Ming in parallel with the bureaucratic administration for some time. Okay, so we know that happened from the Senate states. We have one more young chunk. So this is it's from dated to 1437. And what's interesting about this is he says that his father, who was called Enmongshi, was a descendant of Wu as well, right? But when the Ming conquest happened, he decided it would be better to change their name to a Chinese name from a Mongol name. So he took the surname Yang, which was a very common surname in Dali. And basically made themselves assimilated to Dali society, right? By taking a young surname, and they already had land. They had Wu had served as was a magistrate, right? After they settled in Shizhou, he is supposed to have been a magistrate according to this inscription, and then they had been granted land near to this Hongwei cemetery. Okay, they had two sons, Jiangsheng and his wife. The older one became a monk as well, so we know we have this tradition of monasticism in this family, and then the younger one married a woman of the Li family and became an administrator in the garrisons. So he took a job with the new Ming state, right? They set up their armies in garrisons around the peripheral areas, and a garrison is like a giant fort that also has a bunch of farms, right? Because it's supposed to be self-supporting, and it's supposed to stay there for hundreds of years. So you can't, like most people spend their time farming. They also recruited from the local area, administrators sometimes. Yeah. Okay, so we have this example of a Mongol clan that settled in Dali and basically assimilated in local society. We also have a number of examples of families who basically served whichever regime was in power as long as they were there, right? So this one is another unrelated young, as far as I know. Young Julie, his given name was Young something else, and his wife was Zhu. So this one again is composed by Youngson, that early early examination graduate, and an official in the provincial government in their calligraphy. Okay. So this one says his acquired surname was Yang, originally from Hongnom, surely distant. So Hongnom is an area in what's now Shanxi, and it was in the Tang period. There was a young clan that was one of the major families that was from there, later destroyed. So one of the things that happens later is anyone who has the surname Yang will say, "Oh, I'm related. I'm from Hongnom," right? There's use of it's called a coronym, the use of a place name as an identifier for your family ancestry. Whether or not it's I don't know came to Delhi, he was Syrian. And according to the genealogy, it's a bit illegible here. It seems like he served the local lord of the non-clan, right? So we have number one, Nanda service, the Wei king. So that's the name of one of the Nanjao kings. This young from Hunong, took the tribute name Shengming and became the Buyid, right? So this is not a term from the Chinese bureaucracy, but a term from the Nanjao bureaucracy. And I think it meant something like Grand Counselor, right? It's the highest level of official that we know about. Okay, so Shengming's fifth generation descendant Zhang became the Jiao in Dali's circuit. So we've skipped over 300 years, and now we're in the Dali, the Yuan period. And then Jiao is the name of a Yuan official, right? A low-level official. He was promoted to magistrate of Muding Circuit of Jinsha Commandery, that's west of Dali in Yunnan, and deputy prefect of Chengchong Prefecture. So that's the civilian administration that's in the same place as Jinsha Commandery. Zhang gave birth to Man, who started as Jiancheng Circuit Magistrate. Man gave birth to Hai, who was a plain man and based, honest, and sincere. Right, this is the person who is, that's central unity. Yes. Okay. So, what we can see here is the family takes pride in its history of serving as an official in various administrations. It's a source of status for the family. They're not that worried about loyalty to a specific administration. They're more worried to demonstrate their family status over a period of time. Yeah. So this young Ying, he served as head of the village, according to this inscription, under the Ming, right? The village as if the taxes were unequally distributed, he distributed it incessantly, right? So he's trying to make sure that the taxes are being, collected for everybody in the village. Because of this, his family and his hometown received it. And then later on, he abandoned the fields on which he lived in order to become imam. So again, we have this family tradition, official service, and then also religious life. Okay. Yeah. The other interesting thing about this one is it seems to have been written before Mr. Yunnan had died. So when they were in the 60s, Yunnan said, hey, we're going to die soon, can you please write us a funerary inscription? So they wrote the funerary inscription, and presumably later, there's no date of death on it, right? Often there is a date of death. So presumably later after they had died, they would have got the funerary inscription. Okay. Last two examples are about people who came to die. So the Ming garrison system is one of the major methods by which people we now understand as Chinese migrated to Yunnan, right? So in this period, you can start to think of Yunnan as being like a colonized periphery of Ming China, right? In the way that we would now think about the northwest or the northern frontier in the same way. There are two kind of waves of migration. The first one is through the garrison system in the early Ming dynasty. In this period, the state required people whose families were military families, right, paid taxes as members of the military, to give one son to go to live in a garrison somewhere. And in this case, in Yunnan. So when they got there, maybe they will take their families with them if they had them, maybe they'll marry locally. But they don't tend to go home, right? They become farmers, right? So if you go to villages in some parts of Yunnan, you can say, okay, these villages have names that suggest there were camps attached to the garrison. And the neighboring villages will have different types of names, which suggest that they were settled by locals, right? So you have these garrison families living somewhat adjacent to everybody else. And then later on, you have a whole bunch of disputes about the garrison system starts to fall apart, right? They're not getting new people to join them, and the tax system is changing, and then again, I mean, they're not keeping on top of it very well, they're not keeping great records of which of their soldiers are supposed to be paying what taxes. And so by the end of the Ming Dynasty, they're basically just regular peasants like everybody else, right? Okay, so that's the first wave. The second wave doesn't come until the 18th century, which is after the scope of the period that I'm looking at. And that's more civilians, and that's much more intense. There's a population crunch in the Yangtze Delta region, and so people are just moving west to take land. That means they're taking land from the indigenous people who are living there, and then you have a bunch of rebellions, right? Starting from the late 18th century in Guizhou and Yunnan, and then all the way to the 19th century. Okay. So, the first example of a garrison migration is another series from the early 15th century, 1430. This man was based in Jinshe, right? So that's the garrison that's immediately to the west of Dali. So Mr. Wu Weili had clerk in the office of Jinshe Civilian Military Administration in the armies of the Great Ming, courtesy named Yan Yi, a man from the city Suzhou. His late father, Wu Xian, courtesy named Xianzhong, was awarded a post as a clerk as a result of military merit. So that means he was someone who was in the army of the Ming, going around conquering everywhere. He did a good job, and therefore he got a position as a clerk, like a clerical position in the army instead of a fighting position, right? It was a promotion. His mother was Ms. Zhang, who had been awarded the title of European Lady. He, the general, was born on the 17th day of the 6th month of the Bing year of the Yuan, so 1356, and assumed his father's post as a clerk in the Gongchen year of the Hong year, so that's in 1380. So that's even before they officially managed their conquest. Yeah. Okay, so it's very clear, right? They came to Yunnan as part of the army. They stayed. Yep. What else do we know about this family? So 13th, the inscription is from 50 years later, right? So he's taken the job, he's lived another 50 years, he's passed away. We also know from the funerary inscription a bit about their children. So they have 3 sons and 2 daughters. The oldest son, called Xiong, inherited his father's position, and he married a woman called Ms. Fan, whose father was a judge in Chushong garrison, so that's east of Dali, right? The second son is called Nun. He married Ms. Chen of the Dali garrison, and the youngest son was Jun. He married Ms. Che, who was also the daughter of a commander of the Dali garrison. And the oldest daughter married Assistant Commander Fang, also of the garrison, and the second daughter married Battalion Commander Gong, who was also from the same garrison, right? So these garrison families, they're marrying each other, right? They're coming to Dali, they're not necessarily intermarrying with local people, they're marrying other families in the same garrison. It's a large enough community that they can do that. Okay, so that's one strategy. But it was not always a strategy. The last strategy is marrying in. So in Chinese, this is called wu shui. So the patriarchal standard is a woman goes to live with her husband's family when she gets married, right? She does the rituals to his parents when they die. She's basically become part of that lineage. Sometimes a man would marry into his wife's family, which means probably taking on the family name of his wife's family, living at their location, doing the rituals to their parents, right? So if you are a family of early daughters and you need a son to carry on the correct rituals, this is one way you can apply. You can also, there are also like children adoption and things like that. But marrying is an easy one. Okay. So this is the show from the middle of the 16th century, a little bit later. The interim is young Zhou and his wife, Lady Yang. So that's also her maiden name. And it's composed by a central government official. So that's important because he's like, oh, he's running as an outsider. but I'm not part of the society, unlike someone like Yunnan who wrote the previous ones. So he said, I once heard of stories where all men married in, and since birth, I understood them as fantastical. As in ancient times, married women did not have funerary inscriptions, so where would the stories be, right? Like, where would we get these information? Those who told them said, married women follow their husbands, how can they have their own funerary inscription? I said, well, they can. And then I said, here's the proof. Mr. Young, true name Dongjing, courtesy name Wumbai, also called Yunnan. His father, Hua, was a man of Kaizhou County in Yunnan Prefecture in Zhili. So Zhili is the capital region. So it's a province. He's from presumably Nanjili, so somewhere around Nanjing. His grandfather's friend received orders to go to Nanjing to plan to be an official, and then he lived in the rest of his life in Yegu. So Yegu is a literary name for Dali. Okay, so it's the same thing. We know this is someone who has migrated as part of official service to the Ming. And then he stayed in Dali for the rest of his life. In this case, it seems like he was like a civilian, right? He was not a military official. But like the military officials, they settled down in Dali and they stay. And then the rest of the inscription it talks about the son, Yang Dongjing, and his familial situation. So he marries a woman called Lady Yang, who was the younger sister living in the house of one of his aides, right? So when an official was posted to a place, they can't be posted to their hometown, so they probably go somewhere they don't speak the language, therefore they need secretaries who do speak the language, therefore they have aides. So he marries the younger sister of one of his aides. She was also the aunt of a successful examination candidate, so we know it's a family that's got resources and it's a literary family. And then, of course, she has all of the feminine virtues. She manages to make the house, cooking, frugal, lives in harmony with everyone, gets on with the neighbors, etc. The opinion of the villagers was universally that the young household had acquired good helping, that the benefits to her husband increased all the more. And they have two sons, and the two sons married into two other great families of Dali, the Li family and the Zhang family, right? So, what's interesting about this is, okay, so it's not that clear that they were married women that they happened to meet locally, you married their sister or a colleague, sure, whatever. But the author of the inscription has framed it as a moving and marrying in, right? He's explicitly using the terminology that suggests these people from China have gone to Dali and have done the kind of thing that the Mongols we were talking about did, right? They've assimilated in some way to the local society. Okay, so we're nearly done. The last thing I want to bring up is this kind of broader question, right? So we have this idea of Dali as a peripheral region that's being assimilated or sinicized into the main Confucian norms, right? And in some ways we can see that that's true. We can see that they're writing funerary inscriptions that look a lot like funerary inscriptions in other places. But in other ways we can see that they're using these inscriptions to highlight other things that are maybe not so congruent with the kind of orthodox Confucian norms. They're highlighting the ancestry, the Buddhist practice of their family members. They're highlighting their connections to the Nanjiao, which is this non-Chinese state that is considered outside of the sphere of like traditional Confucian society. They're also crossing ethnic categories, right? So nowadays you say, okay, Mongols are this, Chinese are this, people from Dali are Bai or E or whatever. But in this time period, we can see that people are they're shifting, right? They're not attached necessarily to the ethnic categories that we are now projecting backwards onto them. Okay. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.
We will now be taking a few questions. Are there any questions?
Yeah. Okay. Should I take a few questions or just go one by one? Okay. So the question is, where do you see religion mentioned explicitly? And the second question is, how do Confucianism and Buddhism coexist harmoniously in this time period? Yeah. Okay. So a lot of the time in the inscriptions, what we're seeing is references to family practice, right? So it could be or their own practice. So we have someone who is like, if they use a name that's associated with a Buddhist monastery, then we know they have some kind of Buddhist affiliation. If they have a monk write their funerary inscription, then we guess it's probably some kind of Buddhist affiliation. Sometimes, if they're cremated, there's some that seem to have been cremated, and we assume that means there's some kind of Buddhist affiliation. We assume that the sit-down script means some kind of, obviously the image. That's pretty straightforward. So it's very rare that someone will say, I believe in Buddhism, right? Or I am a Buddhist or something like this. They will say, such and such a person into religion. They might say, such and such a person chanted a lot of sutras and brought a lot of merit to their family. They might say they donated very much to this particular temple or monastery and reconstructed a certain building, this kind of thing. How do they coexist? Well, I mean, so this is a problem that the Jesuits had, right? They go to China and they're like, okay, our model of religion is, here's a set of beliefs, here's a set of practices, here are a set of people who adhere to the practices, right? If you belong to one, you don't belong to any others, that's it. And when they looked at China, they're like, these people are not very good at being Confucians because they're going to Buddhist temples all the time, right? Or the other way around, right? And they're trying to get them to convert, and they're like, oh, they're still sacrificing to their ancestors. That's a Confucian thing. You know, they have a lot of facts about it. And the Protestants don't, and they have a lot of facts about it. And so nowadays, when we're asking this kind of question, that's the model of religion that we're bringing to it, right? But in practice, for most people in the past, certainly in China, but also elsewhere, it wasn't like that. You don't have to belong. If you enter a temple, okay, then you've joined that one. But you can come out, right? You can change. But also, even if you're not going so far as to enter a temple and become a monk, you can go to a Buddhist temple on such and such a day of the year, and then the next day you can go to the Dragon King Temple Festival and pray for water. And then, because you are a citizen of the Ming State, when you go to the magistrate is required to do sacrifices at the Buddha temple every year, right? Every so often. And so there's a whole state ritual, which is when we now talk about Confucianism. There's the state ritual and then there's the family ritual, right? And they're understood as being part of the same system, right? If the families are all doing different rituals, then the state will be in good order, so on and so forth. So, from the point of view of an ordinary person, you can go and sacrifice to at the Temple of Literature, then take the examinations, and then after you pass the exam, you can also go to the Buddhist monastery and you make the same prayers. That's no big deal, right? No one cares. You don't have to, it's not, even now it's like this, right? There's a saying for later period where people who, you were born a Taoist, you live a Confucian and you die a Buddhist, right? Which means people often do Buddhism for funerary rituals and Confucianism for when you are alive, like marriage or something, and then Taoist rituals in when you have a new baby and you want to make sure they survive their first 5 years, kind of thing. Yeah. And the Han actually it's a little bit more complicated because Confucianism and Taoism haven't separated yet. So yeah, we don't let us argue about that.
Okay, any other questions?
Two questions. One is about financial background. You mentioned they seem to figure from more background, like that, on the administration. So is that the norm? Is that the pattern with everyone who's working in this region?
most families are farming. If you are wealthy families, have a large area of farmland, they may rent it out to other people, so there will be landless people. We assume they're not very wealthy, or they are very, but they don't have the money to pay for an inscription, right? The money that it costs to get the inscription made is kind of the barrier to entry, right? So I think most of these people are wealthy farmers, landlords. Some of them later will be making money by trade, but most of them it will be either sideline family farm kind of thing. In the 19th century, you get these kind of large trading corporations who are really managing the long distance trade. Yeah. So it's basically an agricultural society. There is trade going on, and the stratification is based on language primarily. I think we don't have a lot of details. This is the problem. Second question was about very good. Yes. So a few of these tombs there are a few tombs that have been excavated in the late 20th century, and they do have in fact grave goods. So exciting. We have in Delhi specifically. So the Delhi City Museum has a bunch of them, and then we have a lot of like models of horses and animals, that kind of thing. The kind of longer tradition in Chinese history is to bury with things that the deceased will want to use in the afterlife, right? And then you burn paper money and things like that for them later, so they'll also have that. Yeah, so we do have great goods. The ones that I've seen are the ones that are like nice looking to put in a museum. But yeah, it seems like they're in addition to, we do know for sure that they did the things that people use, they also made representations of like animals and stuff and then buried those as well.
Any other questions?
So Dali, as I know, is at a cusp of South Asia, existed very below. So do we happen to see any influences from Southeast Asia which are related or vice versa?
Yeah. So it's not to know about funerary practice per se. There's some, because especially the ones that have preserved are the ones like this, right? We know there were also people cremating their families, and they used like more Nagari or Sanskrit inscriptions, which we take to be an influence from either Southeast. So it also depends on you have Southeast Asia, right? Very complex region. And we know that this kind of the Dong world is what we call sort of the Song, the pre-Mongol era of circulation within the upland Southeast Asia. So that's not the Buddhist, not the peninsular oceanic models of Buddhism. There's also the models of, a lot of this is hypothetical, models of kingship that were and remain so much later, dominant in upland Southeast Asia, so Thai-speaking colonies especially, were repeated in the areas immediately southwest of Delhi and sort of the southern Yunnan, what's now southern Yunnan. And there was quite a bit of scholarship on those kinds of areas developing. The other thing, so Delhi we know is different from other places nearby. Like it's more likely to have people reading and writing Chinese than even Chongqing just to the west or the next furthest west or south. But the other thing we have is art historical evidence. So specifically in connection to stuff that's been excavated from, for example, the three pagodas that was mentioned here. We know that there was, we know that some of the Buddhas that have, like the statues that have been silver mainly, excavated resemble more stuff that was coming from the south and circulating in Southeast Asia. Yeah, how some of these monks who went to India to get relief and whoever, they said they went to India. Actually, where they went to was Delhi, right? So this is Bolton right here, and this is Myanmar, the city of Magadha. So it seems like we have again this dual thing, right? The scholarship on the Buddhism of the Sung Dynasty period, the Dalai Lama period, shows that they textually were engaged with Chinese-speaking traditions. They are like literally Chinese sutras from this period that have been excavated. But they are also thinking of themselves as attached to India, as a form of Buddha, in order that people, it does diverge quite a bit from the traditions in Central China. Yeah. So it's this awkward kind of thing where we're trying to navigate both the sources, right? What the literary traditions that we have access to, what we can get excavated, who can get into excavate things, right? And this, at the same time, because we're all trained in the discipline of history or archaeology or whatever we're trained in, art history, through the national boxes, national tradition boxes that we are trained in now, right? Trained in Chinese history or trained in South Asian history. It's very rare trained in Southeast Asian history, you're trained in Vietnamese history or Burmese history or Thai history, right? You don't, it's very difficult for us to get across those boxes, right? Because it requires investment of learning languages and learning the historiography and coming to understand the questions, and then we're shaped by the questions of the historiographical tradition we're working in. So it's a thing that we